Matthew chapter 5, verse 1 and 2. Seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him, and he opened his mouth and taught them, saying. Now, when we read these sort of introductory verses, we kind of gloss over it, and we feel like, okay, that's just setting up the stage, but let's dig a little bit deeper, because we have to understand who Matthew is writing to. Matthew is predominantly writing to a Jewish audience. And because he's writing to a Jewish audience, he has to convince them that this Jesus guy, who's making a lot of claims that many Jewish people wouldn't agree with, is a legitimate teacher. Now, what's important about this is Matthew points out that the setting of the sermon we've been looking for is on a mountain. And to a Jewish person, once they hear this idea that some person of God is going up to a mountain, they would have immediately thought of what? Moses. They would have immediately thought of this other time where God spoke to his people and gave them a way to live and called his prophet, Moses, up to this mountain. And so Matthew's detail there is really important because it's setting the stage and telling people that just as Moses spoke from a mountain and gave people the commands of God, Jesus, speaking from the mountain, is actually going to put those commandments in a much clearer setting. And that's important for us to understand because sometimes we read the New Testament and we think, oh, Jesus is coming with a totally new set of guidelines, a new set of ways to live. But really, no. Matthew is letting us know that, in fact, what Jesus is going to do is he's going to take the commandments and make it much clearer. Because it's really nothing new that he's teaching. He's just kind of opening our eyes to a different way of seeing this. And so right away, the Jewish mind would have paid attention and say, whoa, this is important. Because this guy's speaking on a mountain like Moses spoke on a mountain. And then it says he sat down and he opened his mouth. And that is very traditional teaching style. That's when you read that means that the person that's about to deliver the word is a very, very important teacher. And in fact, Matthew is setting the stage so that people would equate Jesus with what they called scribes. Okay, some of us have heard that word. Now, the scribes were these teachers of the law back then because what had happened is when the Jews were in exile, they started losing their identity. And so they realized that their identity was found a lot in these laws and commandments that God gave them, but they didn't know how to live it out. And so they trusted these experts of the law called scribes to show them how to live. And so when Matthew says Jesus sat down and opened his mouth, he's painting a picture of this guy who's a scribe, of an expert of the law. But what's interesting is later in Matthew, I don't have a slide for this, he says, but he was teaching them as one having authority, not as one of their scribes. So in other words, Matthew is letting that audience know and letting us know that this guy is not only an expert of the law, he's an expert of the law that is able to speak with authority, and so you better listen. Because what he has to say is legitimate. And here's what he has to say in verse 3, okay? Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And this is our verse for today. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. That Greek word for thirst refers to something that you can't live without. It's this desire, that this craving that you want it so badly that you feel that if you don't have it, you can't live without it. It's this craving and this desperation. So when we read things like hunger and thirst, I honestly think that we in the Western culture have a very poor understanding of what hunger is. Wouldn't you agree? I have a second stomach for two things. All you can eat Korean barbecue. Oh, I know. I got hungry. And all you can eat Brazilian barbecue. Right? You see a trend? And fortunately, I married someone who's Korean from Brazil, right? And so when none of those, you can't get those in Taipei. Right? You can get Korean barbecue, but not all you can eat, or it's really expensive. So when we go to LA, my wife's parents will take us to an all-you-can-eat Korean barbecue place, and I could eat for 2 hours. And the secret is don't eat rice, because that's a filler. Don't eat salad, because that's a filler. Just eat meat, right? And you know, I'll eat and I'll eat and I'll eat, and then my wife will be so shocked, and she'll go, wow, you must have been hungry. I go, no, I was not hungry. I was just a glutton, right? I was just lacked self-control. You know, but from our mindset, we see someone that's like eating, and we think that's hunger. That person is hungry. But really, if you think about it, in the world that Jesus was coming from, and in a lot of the third world nations, hunger is something we have a hard time grasping. Right? Because hunger is really experienced by those people in all these other countries that they don't know when their next meal is. You know, these people that we see these uncomfortable pictures on TV or on the internet of just how bloated their stomachs are because they have nothing to fill them. To the point where they probably haven't eaten in many, many days, right? We don't understand hunger to that level. But that's really the hunger that this verse is talking about. You know, but I guess to some extent we could understand the idea of desperation, because we've been in situations where we feel like we got to have this or we got to figure this out. I remember my first high school retreat, my youth pastor was kind of this macho guy. And so we were by this river, and there was this waterfall. And it was flowing really fast, and because he was a macho guy, he said, I'm going to swim and touch that waterfall. And we all advised him, that's crazy. Don't do it. So I think one guy tried it, and we tied a rope, and he couldn't make it, and we pulled him back. But my youth pastor was like, I don't need a rope. So he went, and he swam, and to our surprise, he touched the waterfall. But the moment he did that, the current swept him away. And literally, before our eyes, our youth pastor was swept down the river right by us. And my immediate thought was, oh my gosh, this is my first Christian retreat, and my youth pastor is going to die. Right? That was my first thought. It's like, what am I going to tell my parents who think I'm crazy for following this Protestantism, this Christianity? And somehow, by some miracle, he managed to swim out of this current that was flowing super fast. And so we asked him later, we said, how were you able to escape the river? And he said, I knew one thing. If I didn't swim, I was going to die. And so his thought was, I got to swim as hard as I can, or I'm going to die. I have to swim as hard as I can, or I'm going to die. I have to swim as hard as I can, or I'm going to die. There's that sense of desperation. Or this is it. If I don't do something, if I don't get this, it's over. And that's the sense that Jesus is trying to convey when he uses the word hunger and thirst. So let's talk about hunger. Turn to your neighbor and say, you're hungry. And I say that because whether we admit it or not, we all hunger and thirst for something. Right? Every single one of us in this room, we all hunger for something. Right? Whether it's some relationship that you desire, whether it's financial success, whether it's approval from someone or some sort of validation, whether it's some sort of goal that you've had. There are things that consume our hearts and our minds, and we have this feeling that if I don't have that, if I don't get this, I'm going to die. And these things aren't all bad, but subconsciously, these hungers that we have drive a lot of our decision-making and influence a lot of the choices, right? And they're not bad. But we have to admit that even when we achieve what we're hungry for, that success, that relationship, that vacation we've dreamed of, that retirement, that, financial stability, even when we achieve that, it does not satisfy. Right? I'm going to try this experiment at some point. I'm going to sit my kids down at the table. I'm going to put a bowl of vegetables and a bowl of cookies. Okay? I'm going to say, Timmy, you have free will. You are not a Calvinist. So you may choose, you may choose what meal you would like to have today. What do you think he's going to pick? Cookies. One time, I remember we had finished dinner, so my wife was eating some candy, and he was like, "Can I have some, Mommy?" And we said, "No, you're not done eating." And so my wife would just eat more of the candy, and he was freaking out. He was like, "Oh," he didn't know what to do with himself. We're like, "Just finish your food and you can have some candy." He's like, no. He couldn't eat his food because he was watching my wife eat the candy in front of him. And he almost cried, right? And so the thing is, what happens is you give the kid the candy and they get this sugar high. And all of a sudden, they're bouncing off the walls, right? That's why it's a bad idea to give our kids candy before sending them to the kids' room. Because they go crazy for an hour because their sugar level spikes. But then after a little while, what happens? They're all excited, and then there's this letdown because the sugar level drops. And it's like, wait a minute. You looked full and energetic a minute ago, and all of a sudden, now you're not. Well, what happened? It's because they consumed things that didn't give them the proper nutrition. Do you know what I'm saying? They consumed something that they thought would give them satisfaction, and for a moment it gave them satisfaction, but because what they consumed was not meant to fulfill them, it actually led to disappointment in the end. Right? And that's what Jesus is kind of talking about. St. Augustine says this. I think I paraphrased it because it's like Old English, so I rewrote it. "You made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it rests in you." And so Jesus is inviting us, don't hunger for these things that are not bad. Don't hunger for success. Don't hunger for approval. But hunger for me. Because that's what's really going to satisfy. Right? Isaiah says this. "Why do you spend money for what is not bread, and your wages for what does not satisfy? Listen carefully to me, and eat what is good, and delight yourself in abundance. Incline your ear and come to me. Listen that you may live, and I will make you an everlasting covenant with you." Right? We spend money for things that are not bread. In other words, Isaiah is saying, why do you go after things that don't satisfy? How many of you have friends on Instagram and all they post is food? Right? Or where they've traveled. Right? Sometimes I do that. But I feel like sometimes they say, this is the best food ever. Okay, if that's the best food ever, then stop eating anywhere else. But that's not what they do, right? They go to the next restaurant, and this is amazing, and look at this picture, and they have to take it from the top, so they have to get up on the chair. Or, and it's such a clear picture of this. We spend our resources craving things that we think this is it. This is what will make me satisfied. And then you leave that place, it's like, what's next? What's next? What's next? But Jesus is inviting us to hunger after something different. And to hunger for something that, it says in the verse, will satisfy. So that we don't need to look for anything else. We don't need to look for the next trend or the next thing to fill up our emptiness. C.S. Lewis says this, if I find myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. And we're trying to fill ourselves with things that don't satisfy. So maybe Jesus is saying, if you want to be blessed, maybe you should hunger and thirst for righteousness instead of all the other stuff. All right. So let's talk about righteousness. What does it mean? Anybody? I have bad hearing, so you got to speak up. I really do. It's not funny. To be right, okay? Righteousness to be right, okay? Good. Anything else?
To do the right thing.
To do the right thing. That would make a great title for a movie, okay? Anything else? Okay, well, I mean, it's just like TAS, right? Okay? So a lot of times when we hear that word righteous, we do think it's about this moral thing, right? Doing the right thing, being morally upright. But one way that we can understand righteousness in the biblical sense is it's actually the condition of being acceptable to God. Okay, turn to your neighbor and say, you are acceptable. That doesn't sound very encouraging, right? It's like, oh, what do you mean I'm only acceptable? But okay. Sorry. Okay, you are acceptable. A lot of times it's interchanged with the word, this big Christian word, justification. Okay? And the idea is, as we've read in the past few weeks, we were once in a state where honestly we were not acceptable to God. We had offended God. We were living a life that was saying, I want to live my way. And then through the process of God showing us that maybe your way is not the best way because of sin, He restores us and now we are acceptable. So in one biblical sense, when you read righteousness, it's the state of being acceptable to God. Being right with God, right? One of the easier ways to be righteous is to be right with God, as Jeff said. Okay, so maybe Jesus is asking us to hunger for that, and I think that's a good thing to hunger for. But in the broadest sense, and I love this definition, the broadest sense in Scripture, the Greek word there for righteousness, which I practiced like 50 times, but I don't know how to say it, so I'm not going to say it, is the state of him who is as he ought to be. That's the proper response. Okay, let me read it again so we can respond accordingly. It is the state of him who is as he ought to be. Let that sink in to how profound that really is. So one way to understand righteousness is this sense of wholeness. Whereas before, because of the way we were living and because we were self-centered, we were separated from God, so we were no longer whole. All of a sudden, because our sins are forgiven, we now are as we ought to be, as God created us, like in the garden, right? There's no more separation. So righteousness that we're to hunger for, in a sense, is I want to be whole. I want to be the way God designed me to be and the way I ought to be. It said in the Bible of Abraham that it says Abraham believed and it was reckoned or credited to him as righteousness. It's almost the sense of before Abraham believed, he was not full. He was like the shell of a person. And because Abraham believed God, that's when he became as he ought to be, a whole person. Right? And if you think about it, aren't we designed and created to be people that believe God? And doesn't life get all messed up when we become people who don't believe God and kind of do it our way? And so there's this sense that Jesus is saying, hunger to be right with me, so that when you're right with me and our relationship is good, then you are as you ought to be. You are full and whole as a person instead of a shell. Are we there? Yes. Thank you. Now, what's interesting is this verse, hunger and thirst for righteousness, actually acts as this very clear transition in the Beatitudes. Okay, and let me kind of explain what I mean. Okay, so can we put up the slide with the first three? So the first three Beatitudes we had are poor in spirit, those who mourn, and meekness. And think of the crowd, right? The crowd is hearing this, and they're like, what? What do you mean poor in spirit is blessed? I didn't come to church to hear that. And then Jesus goes on and he says, those who mourn? Like, what? What do you mean I'm blessed if I mourn? I'm not blessed, I'm sad. Feel sorry for me. What do you mean I'm blessed if I'm meek? That shouldn't make sense to the audience. And then, next slide, Jesus says this, right? Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for the righteousness. And all of a sudden, in the crowd, there's this first they're like, what? You're crazy. And then, well, it's kind of hard to argue against that. Right? And there's this shift. And then it goes on to the other three verses, which say, blessed are the merciful, blessed are the pure in heart, blessed are the peacemakers. And I can almost see the crowd. All of a sudden, they start agreeing. It's like, what? That's weird. Maybe. And then, yeah, that's a good thing. Pure in heart, yeah, that's a good thing. Peacemakers, could be a good thing. Right? And the reason why it acts as this transition is if you look at the first 3, it actually comes from this position of emptiness and brokenness. Right? When you're poor in spirit, when you're mourning, when you're meek, you're empty. You're broken. And you're blessed because that allows you to understand how much you need God. And then here comes hunger and thirst for righteousness. And it seems like that launches you into this whole other realm of overflow. Do you get what I'm saying? It's almost like you're blessed if you're empty, and the result of that emptiness should be for you to hunger and thirst to be right with God. And in that hungering and thirsting, you get launched into someone who's merciful, someone who's pure in heart, someone who's a peacemaker. And a lot of scholars will argue that the rest of the Beatitudes actually define righteousness. The rest of the sermon, on the Mount, define righteousness. So when Jesus is talking about a cheerful giver, when Jesus is telling you to when someone slaps you, let them slap the other one. When Jesus is saying those things, a lot of scholars will think he's now expanding what he means by hungering and thirsting for righteousness. So it acts as this catalyst. And I would actually say this. This is not only my thing, but you could argue against it, I guess. When you're poor in spirit, you will naturally be merciful. When you understand you have nothing, you will naturally give people mercy and understand that maybe you were in that place. When you've mourned, and remember we talked about mourning is you're mourning because you understand how sinful you are. When you mourn and understand how ugly your heart is, then you can start the process of becoming pure in heart. When you're meek and you don't retaliate, then naturally you can be a peacemaker. And so there's not that it's a process, because I don't want you to think that the Christian life is you start poor in spirit. It's not that. But there's something going on where hungering and thirst for righteousness acts as this catalyst that enables us to live this life of being a cheerful giver, to live this life of being able to be a peacemaker, to live this life of being pure in heart and being merciful. Right, because the past few weeks when we've lived here, we've talked about how this shows us how empty we are and how much we need God. And it's almost as if you don't fill that emptiness with something that is God-filled, you'll never be able to live the life that God has called you. If we realize we're poor in spirit and we're meek, and if we realize how awful we are, but we still hunger for the same things, then how can we possibly live the life that God has called us to live? So being hungry, I would say, is really key in us actually living the life that God calls us to live. My daughter was sick last week. That's why they weren't here. Now my wife is sick. I was sick before that. Man, my son must just have great immune system. But when my daughter was sick, we tried to feed her and she would not eat. Because why? She had no appetite. And so in some sense, I would say this. Hunger is an indication of physical health, is it not? When you have no appetite, I would say you're kind of sick. Like Pastor David has no appetite. Like Audrey, my daughter, had no appetite. And so I would say this. Hunger is also an indication of spiritual health. And so the question, Pearl Church, that we have to answer is, are we hungry? Because there are some people that are just so sick they don't eat for days. And they're okay with that, and their body is okay with that. But I think that if we're physically healthy, we will hunger for food. And in the same way, I think if we are spiritually healthy, we will hunger and thirst for righteousness. It's all over the Bible. Psalm 42. As the deer pants for flowing streams, so pants my soul for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, the living God. When shall I come and appear before God? Psalm 84. My soul longs, yet faints for the courts of the Lord. My heart and flesh sing for joy to the living God. Right? There's this hunger that we read all throughout Psalms, and we have to check our temperature. Do we have that? All great revivals are marked with this hunger for righteousness, this hunger to get right with God. If you study revival history, anytime there's a great revival, there's this movement where people realize, I have to get my life right with God. I have to live in a way that I can be as I ought to be. One of the famous ones in America was called the Great Awakening. And one of the leaders of that was Jonathan Edwards. And there are stories that when he would preach, people would hang on to their pews because they were scared of slipping into hell. And you would walk out in the streets when this revival was happening, and people would cling to trees because they were scared of slipping into hell. Now, obviously, they had a very poor understanding theologically of what's really going on there. But do you see the desperation? Do you see the realization that, oh my gosh, if I don't swim, I'm going to die. If I don't swim, I'm going to die. If I don't get right with God, I'm going to die. If I don't get right with God, I will never be satisfied. Right? That is what Jesus is asking us to hunger after. Can I get the music team come up? So Pearl Church, let's close our eyes, and as usual, I just want us to reflect on a couple things. First being, what do you hunger for? You know, God knows the answer, so you might as well bring it to the forefront. What do you hunger for? Is it success? Is it comfortable living? Is it financial success? Is it a job? Is it recognition? What do you hunger? What drives you? What consumes you? And I'd also ask us to just take our spiritual temperature and ask ourselves, do I hunger to be right with God? Does it bother me when I feel like I'm not right with God? Do I hunger to be as I ought to be and to let God fill me so I could live the life that He wants me to live? It's very simple. Do we hunger? So let's take some time to answer that question just between us and God, and however you want to respond, that's fine. And then the music team will lead us in one last song.